Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for tuning in this afternoon for our last free webinar of this season, or at least that's what we think is going to happen. We're going to be taking a break for the summer. I'll tell you more in a bit. But today we're looking at the subject of overcoming bias in the workplace and how leaders can drive change. And this webinar is presented by Smith Business Insight and by Queen's Executive Education. My name is Meredith Dalt, and I'm a business journalist here at Smith School of Business at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to tell you and remind you, as I always do, that you will be receiving a recording this presentation by email. So stay tuned for that. We also post these things up on the Smith Business Insight webinar. So if you want to share this conversation with anyone, I would encourage you to do that. Also, if you want to ask a question, and I hope that you will ask a question, we have very knowledgeable people with us today, and they want you to ask questions. So use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we will be getting to questions in the last 15 minutes or so of the conversation. So around 45 minutes from now. So while we have three guests with us today, we're going to start in a slightly different way. I'm going to start by introducing our first panelist. She will be giving us a short presentation, and then I will bring in our other two speakers. So our first panelist is Tanya van Biesen. She is the Executive Director at Catalyst Canada, the leading global nonprofit working to accelerate progress for women through workplace inclusion. A recognized leader and influencer with deep experience in the executive search sector at the most senior levels in corporate Canada, Tanya brings more than 2 decades of corporate leadership and diversity experience to her role. Most recently, she co-led the financial services practice at Spencer Stuart and was a key member of the Canadian board's practice. She also led the firm's Canadian diversity practice, specializing in the placement of chief diversity officers and diverse slates of candidates across all search assignments. Tanya is a sought-after speaker on the topic of diversity in the boardroom and has contributed to several research studies and articles analyzing leadership trends and attributes. She also leads the Interrupting Bias half-day program offered online through Queen's Executive Education. Tanya, I am going to mute myself and go away. You're going to give us our presentation, and then I will be back in a moment. Thanks.
Thanks, Meredith. Don't go too far, because this is when I have to figure out how to share my screen with all of you. And I think I'll stop sharing because I just chose the wrong thing to put up. Isn't this the part where nothing ever quite works? There we go. Okay, let me move my little screen out of the way and say hello to everybody. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to join my fellow panelists. And before we get into a conversation, I just wanted to talk to you about a couple of items that I think will help shape a portion of our conversation today. But before I do that, for those who aren't familiar with Catalyst, we are, as Meredith said, a global not-for-profit. And our lead foot, because we were founded in 1962, our lead foot is around gender, advancing women in the workplace. So in 1962, we were all about getting women into the workplace and supporting them while there. Very research-based, so we are data and insight-driven and have been since 1962. Now we've continued on that journey, and while gender continues to be our lead foot, the lion's share of the work that we do today is around inclusion. So inclusion, of course, implicates all of us, all people, but in particular, Catalyst takes a look at that from the perspective of gender and the intersections of race, ethnicity, sexual orientation. We do less around abilities. We would certainly direct you to other resources if that's what you're thinking about. But this notion of intersectionality as it relates to inclusion is what we are very focused on today, recognizing the diversity of our population, the diversity of our workforces, and how companies can actually harness all that talent for the betterment, not only of their company, but for society at large. So that's who we are. And if you haven't engaged with us previously, I would encourage you to go to our website and learn a little bit more. But there's really 2 topics I wanted to share with you today. The first is around inclusion. So diversity and inclusion, diversity, equity and inclusion, equity, diversity and inclusion, these are all terms that are discussed very actively these days. And I wanted to land on specifically inclusion and talk about that a little bit because it is often the least understood of those 3 terms. Catalyst has, over the last just about 10 years, done a deep dive research into what inclusion is, what it looks like, feels like, what people actually experience when they say they feel included. We have done that across geographies, so across countries, cultures, languages, races, ethnicities, to look at it from a global perspective. And we launched a report actually earlier this year that shared, which will be available to you after the webinar, that shares a couple of things that I want to highlight today. The first is that what we've found is there are effectively 5 hallmarks of inclusion. So when a person says to you, I feel included, they are generally pointing to these 5 areas of feeling valued. So you feel appreciated and respected for what you bring to the workplace. You feel trusted. So you feel like you're making meaningful contributions and you have some say and some influence in decision making. You feel you can bring your authentic self to work, so you're not covering aspects of your identity or feeling like you need to park those at the door or leave them at home. And you feel psychological safety. And many of you may have been exposed to psychological safety. It's coming into parlance more and more these days. But in this case, it's psychological safety from 2 perspectives. One is that you don't experience fear of repercussion. So if you make a mistake, if you do the wrong thing or say the wrong thing or perhaps have a differing view from others, there is safety in the environment. So you will not lose your job, you will not be penalized. So there's that kind of psychological safety. There's also the psychological safety about being able to take risks, coming up with novel ideas, coming up with, curious solutions to things, coming up with something different. So psychological safety is central to this notion of inclusion. Now, I wanted to share with you that in our research, one of the things that was most telling was that a manager's influence, a manager's behavior has tremendous, tremendous influence over an employee's experience of inclusion. And in this context, when I use the word manager, please know that it could be anyone leading a group of people, whether you have a big group of direct reports, you have a small group of direct reports, you're maybe a project leader for 2 or 3 months in a situation where you have a group of people that are working with you. So it doesn't have to be kind of a formalized organizational structure type of manager. It's any time you actually have oversight for and influence over people. And the managerial behavior, how you behave as a leader, has huge influence. In fact, it explains 45% of what a person feels when they say, I feel included. And I wanted to drive this point home because I wanted to share with you how much we each have a role to play in building an inclusive environment. Each and every one of us has a tremendous role to play.
Tanya, I'm going to interrupt you just now to say that the slides are not changing for the audience. So we're still seeing the Catalyst main slide, and we're actually seeing your whole, we're not seeing the slides. We're seeing the PowerPoint program, not your slides.
Okay, let me stop share and
the
try
audience
again.
Would love to see them if you can.
Let me try again.
I know technology every time.
Okay, do you see the title slide here?
We're seeing the title slide, but we're seeing your PowerPoint screen as well. So what you need to do is click on slideshow.
Yeah, no, I had it there.
Yeah.
Sorry, folks, I don't know what's happening. So let me.
Okay, we're just keen to see them.
I know. Okay, let's try again.
Thank you to all of those of you in the audience who are letting us.
And I really apologize for that.
Well, is it possible for you to scroll? So we're still seeing the PowerPoint layout, but is it possible? Aha, that's better.
All right.
Audience.
My apologies.
Thank you. Okay, I'm muting.
Okay, so thank you, Meredith. So this was the slide about how much influence we each individually have over the people that we work with and that report to us, again, whether it's on an organizational line basis or on a project basis. Bottom line is we have a ton of influence over how an employee will express their feelings of inclusion. So how do we as leaders, managers of people, build a more inclusive environment? We've broken that down into 2 sets of leadership behaviors: leading outward on the left and leading inward on the right. And I'll start with leading outward, which is really about, first of all, it's pretty simple. It's about your interactions with your people, leading outward. And it's about ensuring that your team members are empowered, that they're treated fairly, and that they can truly flourish at work. And so there are 3 underlying behaviors as listed here. Accountability is the first one, which is, that's not surprising, right? This is about holding your team members responsible for their behavior, for their development, and for their work processes. So not only at their outcomes, but also how they get their work done. That's what we mean by accountability. The second is ownership. Again, perhaps not a surprise to you. And this is really about guiding your team members to actually solve their own problems and make their own decisions. So really encouraging your team members not just to come to you with problems, but actually to come to you with problems and starting set of solutions so that you can help them figure out the answer and empower them to make decisions. And then the third one is allyship. And this one is critical. It's critical all the time, but I think in this particular moment that we find ourselves in post the George Floyd killing and other, obviously many others in the US, and what we're experiencing in Canada from a race perspective, this is about actively supporting people from underrepresented groups. So this is actually about speaking up and calling out discrimination, bias, offside comments, microaggressions. This is about truly taking action to support other groups. So that's leading outward. The leading inward behaviors are about you and how you interact with you and self-reflection. So it's really about your ability to act courageously, to learn from mistakes, and to self-reflect. And the 3 behaviors here include curiosity to start with. So this is about proactively seeking out different points of view versus always going to the same set of go-to people. Humility is naturally taking ownership for your mistakes, but also being open to sharing those mistakes with others, as opposed to sort of pretending that you're the all-seeing, all-knowing leader. And then finally, courage. And courage is about standing up for what's right, standing up for principles, even if you are being challenged, perhaps by powers above you, and providing your team air cover when you are standing by these principles. So what we found in our global research was these 6 behaviors are the things that drive an inclusive workplace. And again, we'll share those resources with you after. And so the second thing I wanted to talk about was something called emotional tax. So Catalyst has done a lot of work around, as I said early on, intersectionality, and in particular, we have studied and continue to study the experiences of people of color in workplaces. We did a big study in the US. We came out with a big study last year in Canada. We are extending that study actually to include now Indigenous voices in this research. Today, I will talk to you about the research we launched last year, which speaks specifically to the experiences of Black, South Asian, and East Asian professionals within a Canadian context. But I'll start here with this quote. It is counterproductive to deliberately add people to an organization because of their diversity and then consider that discussion of diversity off limits. And so this is the real distinction between diversity. If you look at let's take Toronto alone, where I'm sitting today, 52% of people in Toronto identify as visible minority or people of color. But if we can't talk about that, if we can't celebrate that, if we can't harness that, if we can't include that, then we don't have inclusion. We just have a bunch of people who are coming to work, probably covering aspects of their identity. And I'll talk a little bit about what effects that has. So this notion of emotional tax, this research that we did, emotional tax is effectively 3 things. It's the combination of 3 things. It's feeling different due to aspects of your gender combined with race and ethnicity. Now, the study, by the way, covers men and women. So it's this sense of being different in the workplace and feeling different, combined with being on guard to possible bias, actual bias or possible bias. So, it's this sense of I have to put some body armor on every day before I step into the workplace. Plus, then attendant outcomes from a well-being and productivity perspective. So these three things together make up this concept of emotional tax. And what we found in our Canadian study is that 77% of women and men of color, again as defined in this study as Black, South Asian, and East Asian professionals, report being highly on guard to instances of bias. Very, very high percentage. And keep in mind, this is a very large component of the Canadian workforce. And this group of people is experiencing very high, high incidence of feeling on guard. I'll give you an example here. I work, and our study, by the way, did both quantitative and qualitative pieces. So this is one of the, I'll share a few of the qualitative components. I work from home, so none of my callers can see me. Based on the sound of my voice, they assume I'm a young Caucasian female, and so they're very comfortable making very racist comments against different nationalities. I have to pretend that I'm not offended, and I'm encouraged by my superiors to suppress my true identity. And I could give you many more examples just like this. So the second key finding we found is that those who are highly on guard, and remember that was 77% of the group that we studied, have high intent to quit their jobs, and they also have a high incidence of sleep problems. So the high intent to quit is kind of obvious. The sleep problems, if you are over time experiencing high levels of sleep problems, and you are then expected to come to work every day and be highly productive, you can all see how that starts to break down over time. And so that does impact both your well-being at work and your ability to be productive. I'll pass through this next one and land on this, which is despite all of this, the people in our study want to succeed. This is an unbelievably motivated group of people who aspire to positions of leadership. So despite all of this, you still have this incredible group of people who are saying, you know what, I'm experiencing this, and yet I am bound and determined to be successful. So harnessing that is something that we as leaders really need to understand and figure out so that we can make sure that we're actually driving true inclusion. So what we learned in our study is that this notion of empowerment is actually key to retaining people. The more they feel empowered, the more they feel valued for their unique pieces, what they bring to the workplace, the less they are likely to feel on guard to bias, and the lower intent to quit. How do you do that? 4 strategies. Talk to me. Talk to me. As a manager, encourage. I, as a manager, need to be encouraging the people of color that I work with to talk about their experiences, and I need to encourage my whole team to be doing that so that all of my teammates understand what these different experiences are. Trust me. Trust me to do my work, and trust me to do it in a way that works for me. It's not always going to be the same, but evaluate me not only on my outcomes, but also on how I do it, and recognize that it's not always going to be the same across everyone. Stand by me. When issues occur, back me up and give me air cover. And this one's particularly important because what we know to be true in not only Catalyst research, but more broadly, is that people of color don't experience the same kind of air cover from their managers than the dominant group does. So air cover is given differentially. And as leaders and managers, we need to understand that. And we need to understand that in order to achieve inclusion, we have to start thinking about that equitably. And then finally, equip me. Give me the tools to do my job, because that's the other piece, is resources and access and information is not always shared equitably. So make sure as a leader and manager, you are giving people what they need to be successful in their roles. And so Meredith, I will leave it at that and turn it over to you.
All right. Thanks very much. Tanya, I will note that your microphone is seeming to sort of cut in and out. So I don't know if there's a way you can give it a shimmy so it doesn't cut in and out, but I will mention that. And while you fix that, I will introduce our next 2 panelists, and I'm very glad we get to bring them into the conversation. Stephanie Simpson is an Associate Vice Principal, Human Rights, Equity, and Inclusion at Queen's University. She's been a member of the Human Rights Office at Queen's since 1996, starting in the portfolios of Anti-Racism Advisor and Education Coordinator. In her current role, she leads the Human Rights and Equity Office and plays a key role in fostering both competence and legislative compliance around inclusivity, diversity, accessibility, and human rights. Stephanie has also supported inclusivity and equity efforts in Kingston through her roles with the Black Inmates and Friends group, through her consultation and education services efforts with organizations such as Interval House, the Limestone District School Board, and Kingston General Hospital, and through her role on the Kingston Immigration Partnership Operations Committee. Stephanie's a sought-after speaker on issues related to anti-racism, anti-oppression, social justice, and domestic human rights. Stephanie, thank you for being with us today. I'm also going to introduce Av Maharaj, who is the Chief Administrative Officer at Kraft, Heinz, Canada, and VP of the Legal, Corporate Affairs, and HR. His role covers several areas, including M&A, crisis management, government relations, corporate social responsibility, and ESG, media communications, advertising, marketing law, labor and employment matters, litigation, and cross-border issues. There is nothing this man does not touch in his role. Prior to 2016, Av worked at the Canadian law firm Faskins as counsel, where he was engaged in a variety of client development and transaction management matters. Prior to this, Av held senior positions at the Kellogg Company, including serving as a member of the Canadian Executive Leadership Team and Vice President, International Legal. Av is the former chair of Legal Leaders for Diversity and continues to be a passionate advocate for diversity and inclusion in the legal profession. He has received several awards, including being named In-House Counsel of the Year by the South Asian Bar Association and a Diversity Champion by Women of Influence. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, all of you, for being here. What an important conversation we are having, and your experiences matter a lot. So can we start by framing the topic? Tanya, thank you for your presentation. Can we talk generally about where we are to date? I mean, we've seen some progress in this area. Tanya, you've given us some nice sort of solid ideas about where we can start. But do you guys want to start, maybe Stephanie and Av, can I bring you into the conversation by having you reflect on your thoughts on where we are in terms of diversity in the workplace in Canada? And it's kind of broad, but.
Stephanie, you want to go ahead?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll start. So where are we in diversity? Listen, the one thing I always start off with is we have to celebrate the positive when we can. We have come a long way. I'm South African born. So, you know, I was born under apartheid. Didn't grow up there, thankfully. I spent most of my life here, though I do go back from time to time. I actually go back every 2 years. And so from where that started to where we are, we've made amazing strides. But there's still a long way to go. There's still a long way to go. And once you get beyond the major centers in Canada, we still have many, many challenges to go. Toronto is an incredibly diverse place. We have done many, many positive things for individuals, visible minorities, women, Indigenous communities, but there's still a ton to go. We're not even close to the finish line. So that's usually the way I start with these discussions.
Okay.
Stephanie, anything to add there?
Well, I'm wondering also where we're behind. So you say we have a long way to go. Where are we behind, Stephanie?
Where are we behind? Well, I would start by echoing what Av has said. I think, you know, we're at a really interesting place. I've been doing this work in post-secondary, as you were suggesting, for almost 30 years. And, you know, that can be read as a good thing or a bad thing. But the good thing about it is that I've been able to kind of, you know, see over time, you know, where the changes have been within my institution, and I can see the changes that have occurred. That, you know, just 10 years ago, we were not having the kinds of conversations about equity, diversity, and inclusion that, you know, are becoming so, you know, expected and normalized within our workplace today. So that is huge. Like, I remember times when, you know, us coming into a space, a boardroom, a meeting to talk about these issues, it was strange, and it was not always welcoming to do that. So I think that's huge. Where are we way behind? I think that question kind of presumes that there's some sort of linear, progression that we're expected to make, and that there is, kind of an end state that someone has identified. Like there's somebody out there that is doing this work remarkably well, has solved all of the problems. And so, we're kind of benchmarking ourselves in relation to that. And I think the fact is that we're actually in a place where in some ways we've never been before, and the answers are not, in my mind, always obvious. I think that a lot of institutions continue to be challenged and to struggle with, well, what are the next steps? Where do we go from here? And I really value, for example, Tanya's work, the work of groups like Catalyst that are actually, going out and doing the evidence-based work to get a better sense of where we ought to go. So I guess what I'm saying is that I think that this is a bit iterative. I don't feel that we're behind. I feel like we're, kind of on the edge of something, tremendously exciting in terms of transforming our workplaces. And there needs to be some discussion about, okay, well, how do we better mobilize all that we have in terms of diversity in our workplaces and becoming more inclusive.
Okay. And do you see those conversations? Do you see that changing? Do you see that maybe at the corporate level? Tanya, you work with a lot of different organizations. Are people more? Have there been a change in terms of people's investment in the subject?
Yeah, I mean, I would say so. I mean, when I started the practice of law, unfortunately, last century, it was very, very different. People had a license to tell off-color jokes about other races, to Tanya's quote. And that would be completely and utterly unacceptable now. I think we've made progressions. In the corporate world, you see way more active precedents, I think, on diversity and inclusion. And I think that's a very, very positive thing. And it's funny, when I started at a couple of companies, a couple of jobs a while ago, people said, well, the best person for the job gets the job, and that's diversity, which we all know is crap, because you just end up hiring people just like yourself, and then the sort of the lack of diversity perpetuates itself. People don't talk that way anymore, at least the ones I've experienced. So I do think we've made progress in Canada's executive suites.
Right. There's so many things we need to talk about. I mean, we've called this webinar on overcoming bias in the workplace. The subject of unconscious bias, I think most people understand, but Tanya, do you want to touch on how unconscious bias plays out? I mean, have you just mentioned it, and people hiring themselves? Is this just to make sure our audience is kind of fully up to speed on how this happens?
I'm happy to, although I think Stephanie was going to touch a little bit on that, so I'm going to turn the mic to her. Yeah.
Stephanie.
Yep. Either or. Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of really fascinating science that has been done in the last 20 years around unconscious biases, and unconscious bias essentially refers to assumptions about other social groups that form outside of our conscious awareness. And the concept has been explored and has originated in disciplines of neuroscience and psychology and the social science and evolutionary biology to explain the way in which our brains function, our human minds function, to take shortcuts and to make assumptions in terms of everything, every stimuli that we encounter in our everyday lives. But that's inclusive of people. The shortcuts that we take in our thinking affect the way that we see people as well. And this, again, is a very natural, it's something that we all do. It's something, in fact, that humans need to do in order to function. But the danger of that is that too often our assumptions are wrong, or there are problems in terms of how we are are seeing others. We're not acting on full information. And those assumptions then lead us to make decisions that can have very negative impacts on people's lives. Everything from, the kinds of things that Av and Tanya were talking about in terms of the, diversity within the C-suite and the boardroom, to the tragedies that we've seen unfolding in terms of things like policing. So that's unconscious bias in a nutshell. But I also wanted to say, and this is a little bit to Av's point, it's a bit of a thing with me, unconscious bias. I think we've had a revolution in terms of our thinking about equity, diversity, and inclusion, in part because of our ability to understand this concept of unconscious bias. But unconscious bias isn't the only thing that is creating these issues. Some of these biases are real conscious. They're conscious, but they're normalized. And so, it's that people, because of the social messaging that they've received through their lives, take some license, I guess, in the kinds of assumptions that they make about others, possibly because they've never, encountered information that would counter it. But still, those biases are pretty consciously expressed. So I think that there's kind of a whole suite of things that we need to be paying attention to when we're thinking about creating greater inclusion and eliminating discrimination within workplaces.
Okay.
Meredith, can I touch on 2 points? I want to build on what Stephanie has said, because I think one of the sometimes what is your greatest strength can also be your greatest weakness. And so I think that the conversation around unconscious bias has become very commonplace. Many organizations do unconscious bias training, and kind of that's how they work their way into awareness building and so on. But it has also become in some ways, I think it holds us back because it has become a crutch. It's a friendly way. I sort of think of it as a very Canadian way of socializing this notion of bias. It's politer, right? I mean, as Stephanie has defined it, we are all subject to unconscious bias. That's part of the human condition. The challenge with that is there's an over-rotation to that discussion, and we're not talking enough about conscious bias, which is clearly still ever present in our society. We're seeing it play out, in the news cycles every single day. And so we can't forget about that. That's still a huge issue that we have to deal with like head on. And then there's this other piece that has, it's part of the human condition, but some of it is also conscious bias gone underground. Like it's a different way of delivering, it's present in microaggressions, and it's a way of people kind of getting away with the same bias, but in a little trickier fashion. So we have to be very careful. For instance, when we do unconscious bias training, we never do it on its own. We always arm it with this notion of how do you become a more inclusive leader? Because if we don't give people the tools to walk away, like something action oriented to start changing their behavior, then effectively we're just morally credentialing this notion of unconscious bias. We all high five each other on the way out of the training room. We're all unconscious, we're all biased unconsciously because we're human. That's not okay. Like as Stephanie said, that drives decision-making and behavior that's inequitable across groups. And just to build on that, what we see in the workplace is more often than not, although we can surface ugly examples of flat out racism, all the isms, sexism, but more often than not, this comes together in the form of what we call affinity bias. I've said it, right? You hire people that look and sound and feel like you. You hang out with people that look and sound and feel like you. So it's actually a positive predisposition towards a group as opposed to aggression or hostility towards another group. But that positive predisposition towards a group creates exclusionary experiences for others, right? The ones that don't look and feel and sound like you. They're the ones that are maybe not getting access to all the information they need to do their job, or not getting the high profile projects, or not. But so that affinity bias is actually a huge watch out, because that's often what is driving our behavior without us even realizing it, which is why you really need hard and fast checks and balances and systems that actually measure this stuff, right? How many people have we considered for this role? What is the mix of people we've considered for this role? Who makes it from the first interview stage to the second interview stage? What are the questions? Who's doing the interviewing? Like, it's a lot of blocking and tackling to backstop this affinity bias we keep wanting to fall into.
Okay, well, which leads me to ask, I mean, we're sort of 35 minutes into this. We need to talk about, I think what people want to hear are, what are the things that people can be doing as leaders to not fall into those traps? You know, anyone want to speak to that? Like, what can leaders do to be embedding more diversity inclusion into their organizations, to be avoiding these traps, as you just mentioned?
Well, I think, you know, and we've heard words matter very recently. I think that's true, but I also think that the leaders need to walk the talk, and I'll give you an example. We hired somebody at the executive level very recently, and I turned to the recruiter and I said, listen, I want a woman. They said, okay, great. And then they came with a suite of you know, 2 men, 2 women. I said, you didn't hear me. Well, the response, and the recruiter I was working with is, well, these are the top candidates. I'm like, no, you're not fishing in every pond for the best candidates. And so they came out, they went back. I said, go do your homework again. Came back with amazing candidates. The quality did not drop. And we ended up hiring a really, actually, I think one of the strongest candidates we've ever had for this role. And she was a woman. The reason I tell the story is because you got to push this. And you can't be saying, well, we have a policy of doing 50 and 50. And oh, I checked to Tanya's point. I just checked the box because I asked for women in this role, and I'm going to pat myself on the back. No, you got to be a lot harder about it. I don't want to use the word militant because that has the wrong connotation, but you have to be active. You have to be conscious. It is not enough to, even for the presidents of your organizations, to say, you know, I follow this policy, I encourage this policy. It's not enough. The presidents, the C-suite needs to be part of the D&I committee. They need to challenge the HR departments when hiring, terminating, promoting. You know, I remember a job a while ago where I said, okay, we're doing performance reviews. Anybody done a racial bias test against the performance reviews? I mean, are people of identifiable groups being rated lower? Nobody, and everybody looked at me like they freaked out because everybody's thinking about the legal ramifications. Set that aside, do the right thing, right? And you know, that was something we ended up initiating because there was unconscious bias there, because there were individuals that were getting rated lower, and oddly enough, people that were rated lower seem to have a bit of a bias to visible minorities. And just as an all personal plug, I refuse to say the word racialized minority. I just cannot stand that term. So you'll never hear me say that. So I still haven't found a better word than visible minority. So if anybody's wondering why I say that, I hate being considered a past tense. So that's why I never use that word.
Sorry, racialized minority because it's a past tense?
Yeah, when did I become past tense?
Right, okay, just checking. Does anyone else want to speak to some best practices that they've seen at organizations when it comes to diversity and inclusion? Tanya or Stephanie?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I mean, there are, as my friend, Dr. Sarah Kaplan from the Rotman School, I'm sorry to bring that up, says, this is about planting 1,000 flowers. I mean, the companies, and as Stephanie said, so right, there's not a single company out there or workplace that is at the destination, right? They've done it all and they're there. But there are organizations some that have made greater progress than others. And the reason why they've made greater progress than others is because they do see this as it's a journey. And often where we find pitfalls with organizations is they're looking for, and I would say in this era of Black Lives Matter, the most recent movement post George Floyd, companies, they want a quick fix. We've got to have an answer for race. We've got to be able to talk about it. There's got to be something we got to do now. And it's treated a bit like, you know, maybe a cybersecurity or something, like, I gotta fix the holes in our system. Or this is a journey, and it's possibly a forever journey. And so first you got to frame up the problem, right? And how you're going to approach it. And I chuckled a little bit when Meredith, you asked Av about investment, because what we're seeing is like, you know, we are in a heightened time right now around the issues diversity, equity, and inclusion, for obvious reasons. It doesn't always translate into money spent. Okay, so I think it's often one of the first budgets to be cut, even in this time. And so, and yet it's critically important because it's your people. It's the talent that is walking in and out of the door, or in this era, appearing on your Zoom meetings. And it's your entire brain trust we're talking about. But investment, you know, mind share maybe, dollars less so. Anyway, the point is, this is a journey. The companies that have made progress, they are intimate with their data, to Av's point, right? They know, like, they know all of these various data points across levels and job functions, and they've studied that, and they look at trends over time. They recognize that they're not going to be able to debias their people. That's not possible, you know, per Stephanie's definition, but they can start to extract bias out of their systems, right? And they'll probably never debias them entirely either, but they can really start to look at all of their processes and say, how do we pull the bias out? I mean, one, I think, innovative thing, other companies now do it, but several years ago now, the Royal Bank, they started deploying an unconscious bias spotter in any of their important talent meetings. So promotions, compensation, what have you. And this person sits in the room. They do not have a stake in the outcome of the people discussions, right? They're not a manager of the people that's being discussed. They're an RBC employee, but they're independent of the discussion. And their sole job is to point out, I think the words we're using to describe this person are quite different from the words we're, you know, why, let's reflect on that a little, because it's unconscious, much of this. We need someone to call us out. So that's one strategy, in addition to really analyzing your workforce data, because without that data, you don't even have a starting point with which to begin the journey.
You know, it's funny, just to build on what Tanya said there. I say something very often in my organization and others that's mildly controversial, which is, I don't give a rip about diversity in and of itself. And people look at me and like I'm crazy. And I say, the reason why I say that is because it makes us all better. It makes my company better. And when you speak that language, you do get, especially leaders, understanding much better that I'm gonna have a better outcome. I'm not gonna go into the data. The data is, there's just mountains of it. That diverse people with diverse backgrounds that are making leadership decisions, women on boards, women at the executive leadership level, the companies are just better. They do better, their returns are better, their performance is better. And so I tell them, I said, listen, as a leader of this company, I don't care about diversity per se. Of course I do. But my point is, if you speak that language, a lot more people will come with you.
Right. Stephanie, earlier on in a background discussion, you mentioned the notion of reverse mentoring. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that kind of initiative.
Yeah, and I mean, that's just one of many strategies. I want to say that everything that Tanya and Av were saying really resonated with me. That I think that institutions, leadership needs to be bold, it needs to be active, it needs to be even aggressive in terms of, you know, to Av's point, wanting the best, you know, and it's not it's not a zero sum. It's not the best versus equity. I think people have heard, you know, heard this distinction made a lot. It's recognizing that we are going to lose the talent, you know, war battle if we do not get out there and make sure that we are attracting the best, rather than, you know, the folks who we just kind of perpetually cycle through our organization because they look like us. And so the reverse mentoring, just another strategy, whereas, mentoring kind of presumes a senior person imparting their greatness and their knowledge to junior people who will learn their ways and then kind of make their way up the ladder. It's the reverse. It's recognizing what junior people, possibly, for lack of better terminology, within the organization have to teach the organization in terms of their experiences. And I believe that the idea began around technology and having younger workers essentially show more senior folks how to use social media and those kinds of things. So to tap into that a little bit more, and then people realize, well, hey, there's a whole lot that's happening within communities, equity seeking, just as an example, but also within millennial and different communities that we can learn from. So it's turning ideas of power and authority kind of on its head, and recognizing the value that everyone brings to the workplace, and recognizing how much we can learn from one another.
Amazing. I wondered about what you guys think in terms of leaders making mistakes. Those are amazing initiatives, and you see well-intentioned people who just botch it. Any thoughts on that? Mistakes, how to avoid mistakes? No,
never
don't make them.
Mistakes.
Pardon?
Never avoid mistakes.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, they're treasures. Yeah, I agree with Stephanie. I mean, my view is everyone's going to make a mistake in this area, and this is where we all got to learn. We're going to trip over things, but we have to be on the path to make things better. And so it's not going to be a straight path to improvement. We're going to make mistakes.
Okay, because I sometimes wonder if people hesitate because, especially if they feel like they're in a dominant group, maybe they're a gender dominant group, and they don't know what they should say, or they don't want to, I don't know how you handle that.
That's a real fear, Meredith.
Yeah.
I think we have to acknowledge that is a real fear, whether we're talking across gender lines or racial lines, or there is, and we, with our social media culture, we have a cancel culture. One strike, you're out, you're voted off the island. It's quite fraught right now. We just came out with a report today on actually the notion of interrupting sexism. When is a man going to be more inclined or less inclined to interrupt when he sees an act of sexism occurring? And fear is a big part of that, right? And so I think we have to name that and call it out, because otherwise we're not going to get to the next stage of conversation. I totally agree with Stephanie. I mean, even in our inclusive leadership behaviors, right? You have to be humble enough to make mistakes and to learn from them and share them. But as a community of people within our organizations, we also have to be accepting of some mistakes, and we police each other pretty hard. So there's learning that we all have to do to understand that we're imperfect. We are imperfect. Some mistakes are obviously more egregious than others, but as people try to learn and ask questions and hopefully demonstrate curiosity and humility, sometimes they may say the wrong thing, and we have to get comfortable with that in these difficult conversations, because some of them can be very difficult conversations.
Along that same line, I want to ask a question we had from the audience, which is, I struggle to find the right way to stand up for my colleagues when they experience issues of discrimination and racism. What is a meaningful way for me to help? Because it seems like talking isn't enough. Any thoughts?
Well, this actually, I mean, I was thinking about this as we were talking about active, engaged leadership and so on. And I wanted to make sure that I made the point that it's so important to be collaborative and consultative in this approach. And that is a difficult balance to achieve and maintain as well, because, you know, what we hear from communities is to leaders, you know, we want you to do something. We don't want you to, you know, always be expecting us to do the work. We need you to step out and be bold and to take action. And at the same time, you know, taking bold, quick actions can be disastrous if you haven't actually consulted with communities. And communities will also say, you know, people are going ahead and making decisions without us. You know, that adage, nothing about us without us. And so, in terms of standing up, you know, kind of, you know, being an ally to colleagues and so on, I think that the very first thing people need to be mindful of all the time is that you're not, to be thoughtful about not getting ahead of, you know, where people want you to go, and to make sure that you've actually, where it's possible, depends on the situation, have communicated with your colleagues, you know, about how it is that they, how you can help and what it is that they're looking for, I think is really, really critical to engage people in that discussion first of all. Yeah.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that one? Or I've got more questions from the audience. They're coming in now.
The real quick thing I would add, Tanya, I don't know if you had anything to add there, but I'll say it really quickly, is that my piece of advice is this. It's the same as it is in business. If my boss is giving a presentation to his boss and he's wrong, I'm not going to embarrass him in front of his boss.
Right.
You know, I'll pull him aside later and say, listen, you know, I want to fix that. Any more than you want to pick your opportunities to educate, to help. The goal is not to embarrass. The goal is to help people on the journey. And so it's not, once again, it's about, it's not pounding the table at every opportunity, but it's finding those opportunities to teach and to learn. And that's more important than, it may be more important than the moment. Sometimes the moment is, you know.
Uh-oh.
Something is completely outside. You've got to stay. Sorry?
You froze. We had a moment of holding our breath.
I said, you just have to, sometimes you have to stand a post. That's absolutely true. But you got to pick where you want to teach and learn, because that'll get the best opportunity to have that person actually internalize that. Sorry,
right,
Tanya.
Right. Shame gets you nowhere.
Yeah.
Okay. Tanya, did you want to say something about that?
Oh, well, in fairness to the person who asked the question, it sounds like you are not doing this at all, but I think it is important to remind all of us that silence is not support. So being an ally and doing nothing is effectively just agreeing with the behavior that you've just witnessed. So doing something, and to Stephanie and Av's point, you know, go to the person who's been the target of that bias, talk to them, right? Like, let them share with you how they're feeling, what they need, what they want. Maybe share with them what you feel you would like to do. Maybe that's not on side with how they're feeling, but have the conversation, open that up, and you know, maybe they say, hey, I don't want you to do anything, but you've shown that you've heard it, you've seen it, you're concerned about it, and that's the first step.
Okay, thank you. Someone else asks, if a corporation wants to take a stand against racism, I've got that in quotes, what actions or activities should it be doing beyond just public relations type statements? Good intentions, but...
Yeah, so I would say if all you're going to do is a PR thing, don't do that. Because if you're not going to back up your, you know, heartfelt statement with some tangible activity, which is more than a poster program like we don't stand for racism or we value our Black employees, or it is about really It's communication, communication, communication. It's getting close to your data. It's talking to your employees. It's making sure, as Stephanie said, that you're not putting the onus on, whether it's your Black employees or your South Asian employees, to explain to everybody else why this is a problem. It is working on and with the dominant group to say, hey, like, we've got systems at play here that privilege you. You need to understand that, and we need to come together and change that. It's 1,000 flowers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And who wants to, one of you wants to weigh in? Av, you keep freezing. Stephanie gets to talk while you freeze.
No, go ahead, Av.
Yes, exactly. I was going to say, I mean, the anecdote, I mean, the George Floyd situation, I'm proud of my company for learning, because I agree with everything Tanya says. If you're just going to issue a statement, don't bother. You're wasting your time. This has got to be a DNA issue. And when George Floyd unfortunately got murdered by that police officer, we issued a statement, and I got to tell you, I was not happy. And the global head of comms, the president, I said, this is not good enough. We issued a statement about diversity. I thought, you're not saying the words. You're not saying the words Black Lives Matter. You're not saying the words I can't breathe. You need to say those words. And we did. But like I said, the company learned very quickly the right thing to do, and it was great. Within a week or so, we pledged $1 million to various programs around the world, specifically for various Black communities in the United States. We donated here in Canada. But more than that, what we did is we had the presidents speaking of it. We talked about what we're doing. We had an information session, and that doesn't end. So if you're just going to issue a PR campaign, don't bother. People smell the BS.
Absolutely. You're not going to fool equity-seeking communities around, this kind of thing. You have to resource the change in whatever ways make sense to you. I recognize that, depending on the size of your organization, you may have more or less resources, but you need to understand that, where we tend to fall down when it comes to continuous change on these issues is that we don't resource them properly. We expect this work to be done off the sides of people's desks. And we also don't do the work to the points that Tanya made and the work that Catalyst does. We don't collect the data. We don't assess and evaluate. We need to be really consciously engaged in those kinds of activities and giving people the support that they need to engage in them to actually make change. It's not about a poster campaign, most definitely.
Okay, thank you. We're almost at the end of our hour, so I'm mindful of the fact that there are many other good questions coming in, but we're not going to have quite enough time to get to them. Very briefly to finish, someone asks, Tanya mentioned earlier that no organization is at the final destination. What does the final destination look like in your various opinions? I'm going to ask you to keep these answers brief, but I'm thinking we could leave this hopefully on a note of hope, positive change. Is that too simple to ask? Tanya, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I'm not sure there is one, and I think that's I don't think there's not a nirvana, there's not a perfection state, there's not anything like that. But to me, if we could move entirely away from diversity and focus on inclusion, I think that would be progressive. I think if we could openly speak about differences, so rather than this notion of I'm colorblind or I'm gender blind, I actually think we need to be color multilingual, and we need to be comfortable having conversations across difference, or we need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable about it and be more open and less afraid. And so to me, that would be real progress. But how you measure that is not easy. And so this end state, I couldn't even define for you necessarily.
Okay. Anyone else want to weigh in? Av or Stephanie, before we wrap things up?
Yeah, I just want to say I agree with you. I don't think that there is necessarily a perfect place, but as Av said when we started out on this conversation, there has been change, and a Black woman 100 years ago would not necessarily have been able to imagine, me sitting in the role and the position that I have today. And I got this idea from a podcast I listened to, by the way, from Median Andrade from the University of Toronto. So I'm not claiming this as my own, but imagine, what, a Black woman 100 years from now would be thinking about the state that we're in. And I just imagine, as Tanya is suggesting, these conversations and acceptances around difference just becoming much more normalized. And I think that our young people, I think of my own kids, have a lot to teach us in this regard. There are some things, that we old people are hung up on that they don't get at all. It's like, being hung up and discriminating against people around certain differences. They've grown up in a world where that's not even a thing in some instances. So I'd like to see more of that.
Fantastic. Av, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, listen, in 1960, my father graduated from medical school in South Africa and was told he couldn't go to his graduation. He's not white. And he protested. My dad was actually part of the African National Congress. They said, you protest, you don't get your degree, you don't become a doctor, sit down and shut up. That's where we were, right? I agree with exactly what Stephanie had said. I think the future is where everyone has the same opportunity. Everybody recognizes our differences, no matter what they are, gender, sexual orientation, color, whatever it is. But at that point, it, quote, doesn't matter, because we all have the right opportunities. We have equal opportunity to be the best person we can be. That's, to me, is where we need to be.
Amazing. Well, I hate to wrap things. I feel like we could just probably keep going for another hour, but unfortunately, they don't let us do that. I also want to note that was a nice place to end it, given that this is Pride Month, and I wanted to acknowledge that. For our audience, if you're interested in learning more about overcoming bias in the workplace, Tanya van Biesen leads a half-day online Interrupting Bias program via Queen's Executive Education interactive remote learning platform. The next session runs on July 29th, which, believe it or not, is soon. That's in a month. It's crazy. So please visit smithqueens.com/execed to reserve your seat today. There's the URL. This is the slide to remind you to consider that. You can also check out that link there for any other programs that we're also offering. So as I mentioned at the beginning, as we move into summer, we're going to be slowing down on our webinar offerings. That doesn't mean we're giving up on them entirely. We may have one or two through the summer. Those of you who get our emails will find out about them by email. You can also check out Smith Business Insight, our website, Smith Business Insight, where you can read lots of articles, there are podcasts, there are other webinars to watch. There's lots of interesting stuff there, so check that out. So I'm going to just close by thanking Tanya and Stephanie and Av for being with us today. You three have been really fantastic, and I really do say I wish we had another hour, because we could keep going. You've given us lots of great ideas, lots to think about, certainly. And for those of you watching, you'll be receiving this recording, so you can watch it again, share it with your colleagues, that kind of thing. So on behalf of Smith School of Business, I just want to thank everyone for watching today, and enjoy the summer. I hope we'll be back. We will be back at some point, so stay tuned. Enjoy the rest of the day. Thanks.
Thank you.